Under a grey Bavarian sky, May 1945. The last German artillery echoes had barely faded when columns of American trucks rumbled through the ruined streets of Frankfurt. Windows were shattered, facades peeled open like wounds, and the stench of burnt timber and despair clung to every corner. German civilians watched in silence, defeated, hollow-eyed, expecting vengeance. Yet what came next defied every instinct of a crushed nation. Instead of retribution, they saw engineers, medics, and soldiers carrying lumber, food, and medical supplies. Bulldozers replaced tanks. Cranes rose where anti-air guns once stood. The conquerors, it seemed, were rebuilding what they had just destroyed. U.S. Army Civil Affairs Report, May 1945. The shock was immediate. Wehrmacht veterans returning from the front expected labor camps or firing squads. Instead, American officers greeted them with ration cards and pamphlets on democratic reconstruction. It felt impossible, one former Panzer sergeant later admitted. We thought they'd grind us into dust, but they gave us bread and nails. Dramatized composite, Bundesarchiv Oral Collection, 1947. The ruins of the Reich were being reshaped not by hatred, but by the logistics machine that had once powered Allied victory. The American presence was overwhelming, in both scale and precision. Within weeks, the Office of Military Government had mobilized thousands of engineers, planners, and administrators. Convoys carried 3.5 million tons of supplies into Germany between May and December 1945. Food, fuel, machinery, paper, even seeds for crops. U.S. Army Transportation Corps Summary, 1946. What astonished German observers was the speed and organization. Every depot, every rail hub, every city sector was mapped, catalogued, and assigned to an American team. What had taken the Reich years to plan, the Americans executed in months. For many veterans, this was a deeper humiliation than defeat in battle. They had believed in German technical supremacy, precision engineering, discipline, efficiency. Yet now, the enemy displayed a mastery of logistics on an industrial scale that dwarfed anything they had achieved. American repair crews could restore a bridge in 48 hours, reconnecting entire regions that had been isolated for weeks. Power grids flickered back to life under floodlights and generator hum. The same soldiers who had stormed Omaha Beach now carried cables and transformers instead of rifles. Army Corps of Engineers Reconstruction Memo, July 1945. Behind this sudden rebirth lay something the Germans had underestimated all along, the sheer depth of American production power. Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago had shifted overnight from tanks and bombers to trucks, tractors, and prefabricated housing. The U.S. Army didn't merely occupy, it administered, built, and supplied like a corporate empire at war with ruin itself. War Department Transition Report, 1945. Civilians whispered that America's strength was not in its weapons, but in its factories, its paperwork, its uncanny ability to move mountains of material without losing track of a single nail. Yet the wounds of war were everywhere. In Berlin, women cleared bricks by hand as children scavenged for coal dust to heat their homes. In Hamburg, entire districts remained uninhabitable, reduced to skeletons of brick. American military police patrolled alongside German municipal workers, a surreal partnership of conqueror and conquered. I watched a GI hand chocolate to a child standing in front of a crater, recalled one German infantry veteran. It was the first time I felt shame and hope. Dramatized composite. Psychological Warfare Division interview, 1946. This strange coexistence began to transform minds. The American administrators did not speak of punishment, but of rehabilitation. They opened schools, rebuilt local councils, and, most bewildering of all, encouraged former soldiers to return to ordinary work. Within 6 months, 13 million displaced persons had been processed, relocated, or repatriated. The meticulous bureaucracy of destruction was replaced by a bureaucracy of restoration. Allied Control Council Report, 1946. What German soldiers once called the machine spirit of America now worked to feed, house, and employ their former enemies. Still, skepticism ran deep. Many Germans believed this was temporary, propaganda before partition or plunder. Rumors spread of American spies, of secret resource seizures, of hidden retribution to come, but the evidence on the ground contradicted it. Factories that once built Panzer engines were refitted to produce tractors and construction equipment. US engineers worked shoulder to shoulder with German mechanics to restore industrial capacity under strict oversight. Economic Division Report U. Theft Zone 1946. Even coal shipments were prioritized to prevent famine and fuel shortages during the brutal winter of 1946. For veterans who had fought under the banner of total war, the contradiction was unbearable. They had been told Americans were materialists, soft, undisciplined, decadent. Yet here was an enemy army demonstrating discipline of another kind, organizational mastery. Their uniforms were clean, their supply chains flawless, their policies coherent. The war taught us to fear their firepower, one former Luftwaffe officer wrote. The peace taught us to fear their efficiency. Bundesarchiv Letter Collection, 1948. Meanwhile, on the American side, pragmatism ruled. The US feared chaos more than revenge. A starving, desperate Germany risked sliding into Soviet hands or sparking rebellion. The strategy was not mercy, it was containment by compassion. Every sack of flour and every repaired bridge was a weapon in a new war, the battle for Europe's stability. Office of Strategic Services Memorandum, 1945. American military governors understood this with cold precision. General Lucius D. Clay, in particular, saw Germany's survival as a geopolitical necessity. "We cannot feed them forever," he wrote, "but we must teach them how to feed themselves again." Clay Papers, 1946. And so, throughout 1946, Reconstruction accelerated beyond imagination. Train lines reopened, currency reforms began, and schools filled with children reciting lessons in democratic civics instead of Nazi doctrine. American field officers, many of them barely in their 20s, became accidental administrators of a new world. Where artillery once thundered, now came the steady rhythm of hammers and the hiss of welding torches. U.S. Civil Affairs Monthly Review, 1946. The occupied zones pulsed with activity, turning from graves of empire into laboratories of governance. But beneath this surge of progress lurked a mystery that baffled even the Germans themselves. How could a nation that had unleashed such devastation find the moral will to rebuild its former enemy? What secret force drove this reconstruction machine? What unseen engine of policy, industry, and psychology turned destruction into renewal so swiftly? As one veteran murmured, staring at an American-built bridge gleaming over the Rhine, "They've won something greater than the war itself." Bundesarchiv Oral Testimony, 1947. He didn't yet know the truth, that behind every rebuilt road, every powered factory, and every ration distributed, lay a strategy older than vengeance and deeper than victory. It was the hidden doctrine that would shape the next century and transform Germany from ashes to an ally. The secret would soon be revealed, not in the streets of Berlin, but in the quiet offices of American economists, engineers, and generals, drafting a plan that would change the entire map of Europe forever. The secret had a name: the Marshall Plan, though at first few Germans or even Americans understood what it truly meant. In the ashes of a continent, amid hunger, black markets, and political fracture, U.S. strategists were crafting an idea unprecedented in the history of warfare: rebuilding the enemy as the foundation of peace. State Department Memorandum, Jan. 1947. Behind the smiling soldiers handing out rations was a machinery of policy, engineering, and industry that fused compassion with calculation. This was not charity. It was strategy in steel and spreadsheets. At the heart of it stood General George C. Marshall, former Army Chief of Staff, the man who had orchestrated victory across 2 oceans. Now, he turned the same logistical genius that had moved 10 million soldiers toward a different kind of battle, one against despair. His plan would inject billions of dollars into European economies, revive agriculture and manufacturing, and, most critically, bind Germany to the democratic West before Soviet influence could take root. Marshall Speech Draft, Harvard University, June 5, 1947. The Americans called it European recovery. The Germans called it the miracle. To understand its scale, imagine the wartime U.S. supply network, convoys of Liberty ships, endless rail cars, entire factories working in synchronized motion. Now imagine that same network redirected to rebuild instead of destroy. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States shipped over 12 million tons of food, raw materials, and industrial equipment to Western Europe, worth more than $13 billion, over $150 billion today. Economic Cooperation Administration Report 1953. Germany received a critical share. Steel presses from Bethlehem, turbines from General Electric, tractors from Caterpillar, and endless shipments of grain, fuel, and pharmaceuticals. What stunned German veterans wasn't just the material generosity, it was the engineering precision. American reconstruction teams tracked every ton of coal, every bushel of wheat, every kilowatt of restored power. Nothing was random. Even the food shipments were calibrated to provide exact caloric ratios for urban workers, designed by nutrition scientists at Harvard. Public Health Service Nutrition Report 1948. They managed us as if we were part of a machine, recalled one former German railway engineer. But the machine worked. Dramatized composite factories once dedicated to producing Messerschmitt fighters now built washing machines and power tools. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers partnered with Siemens technicians to rebuild electric grids at lightning speed, some sectors restored to 70% capacity within 6 months. Technical Manual TM 5303, 1948. German steel output, which had collapsed to under 2 million tons in 1946, surged past 8 million by 1949. The Ruhr Valley, once bombed into craters, became Europe's industrial heart again. It was as if American logistics had simply changed uniforms, from olive drab to overalls. The secret weapon was standardization. The same modular design philosophy that had produced jeeps, tanks, and aircraft now drove reconstruction. Prefabricated housing units, designed by architects in Washington, could be shipped flat-packed and assembled by untrained laborers in a day. Housing Division Technical File 1948. Bridge repair kits came numbered, color-coded, and accompanied by pictorial manuals, innovation borrowed directly from wartime field engineering. Even the cranes were military surplus, painted over and reassigned to peace. But it wasn't only material infrastructure. The Americans were rebuilding something far more fragile: trust. The currency reform of 1948 was a psychological turning point. Under the watchful eyes of U.S. economists, every citizen was allowed to exchange 10 old Reichsmarks for one new Deutsche Mark, a gesture of fairness that wiped away black market chaos overnight. Bank Deutsche Länder Report, 1948. When people awoke the next morning, shop windows that had been empty for years suddenly filled with goods. The message was unmistakable. Stability had returned under American stewardship. And yet in the barracks and taverns disbelief lingered. For many former Wehrmacht soldiers, the transformation felt almost supernatural. "How can they feed us while our brothers lie buried in their soil?" asked one disillusioned veteran. Dramatized composite. But the answer was pragmatic, not mystical. The U.S. recognized that prosperity was the ultimate antidote to revenge. A content working population was less likely to fall to communist ideology or ignite insurgency. Office of Policy Coordination Briefing, 1949. Thus, every bag of cement and every factory loan was a frontline weapon in the Cold War to come. German engineers soon joined hands with their American counterparts, forming joint commissions to revive railways, shipyards, and automotive plants. Henry Ford II personally toured the devastated Volkswagen factory in Wolfsburg and pushed for its reopening under Allied supervision. Ford Industrial Relations Report 1948. Within 2 years, the first civilian Volkswagens rolled off the line, symbols of a reborn industry under American oversight. Workers nicknamed the car der Käfer, the Beetle, and joked that it was half German, half American. On the technical front, the collaboration was transformative. U.S. material scientists introduced new metallurgical standards. American architects brought modernist design. Agricultural engineers imported hybrid seeds, irrigation systems, and refrigeration units. Even broadcasting resumed through American-provided transmitters, bringing jazz and news into living rooms that once echoed with Nazi propaganda. U.S. Information Control Division report, 1949. The reconstruction wasn't just physical, it was cultural engineering, subtle and deliberate. For the veterans, pride began to mix with gratitude. The same soldiers who once manned anti-aircraft guns now repaired rail cars, printed newspapers, and taught apprentices under the American-led vocational programs. "They taught us how to build again," wrote one former Wehrmacht officer, "and in that they took away the taste of war." Bundesarchiv Memoir, 1952. Still, American planners were not naive. Every shipment came with oversight, every factory with inspection teams, every reconstruction project with documentation that could fill warehouses. Corruption was ruthlessly targeted. Inefficiency was an enemy. The Marshall Plan wasn't a blank check, it was a contract, and it worked. By 1950, industrial production in Western Germany had risen 35% above pre-war levels. OC Statistical Review, 1951. The results were visible in every corner of daily life. Children walked to reopened schools carrying American-made notebooks. Women queued outside bakeries that smelled of imported Kansas wheat. Church bells rang again over scaffolds and cranes. The rubble was still there, but life was louder. "We were living inside a miracle," remembered a former Luftwaffe mechanic. "A miracle built with American hands, dramatized composite, and yet, beyond the statistics and slogans, something deeper was shifting. The psychology of a nation. Gratitude replaced resentment. Cooperation replaced suspicion. The veterans who once saw Americans as invaders now saw them as teachers. In the process, a generation of Germans began to redefine patriotism, not through conquest but through reconstruction. Psychological Warfare Division Assessment, 1950. But this miracle had its price. Germany was being remade not only by bricks and machines, but by ideology, commerce, and dependency. The factories hummed again, but to an American tune. Beneath the prosperity lay an invisible chain, the bond of strategic necessity. And as prosperity spread across Europe, a new question began to whisper through both sides of the Atlantic. Was this generosity, or the most brilliant act of control in modern history? The answer would emerge in the years that followed, as Washington's engineers, bankers, and generals discovered that rebuilding Germany had created something far more powerful than an ally. It had created a model, a template for domination through development, influence through infrastructure, and that model would define every major U.S. foreign policy decision for the rest of the century. By 1951, Germany no longer looked like a nation defeated. It looked like a nation reborn. Railways hummed, cities glowed with new electric grids, and steelworks thundered through the night. The transformation was staggering, even to those who had planned it. In just 6 years, a country reduced to rubble by 1.3 million Allied bombs had become Europe's economic heartbeat. U.S. Economic Cooperation Administration Summary, 1952. The miracle, however, was not spontaneous. It was engineered meticulously through the merging of American strategy and German discipline. For German veterans, the shock had evolved into awe. They watched as their homeland, once a battlefield, became a blueprint for industrial resurrection. The same men who had manned artillery guns in the Ardennes now stood behind assembly lines in Munich, crafting precision tools, typewriters, and cars destined for export under a new name, Made in Germany. It was a phrase reborn from disgrace into pride. Bundesarchiv Industrial Record, 1953. But America's true triumph lay beyond factories and steel. It was psychological. The United States had replaced the symbols of dominance, flags, guns, and marching boots, with something far subtler, opportunity. The Marshall Plan had not just rebuilt buildings. It rebuilt minds. U.S. Information Agency Psychological Report, 1952. Through textbooks, radio broadcasts, and civic programs, the idea of democracy seeped into everyday life. Schools taught civic responsibility instead of racial purity. Radio Frankfurt broadcast jazz, free debate, and news uncensored for the first time in a generation. The sound of freedom had a rhythm, and it played on American equipment. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union glared across the Elbe, watching with suspicion. East German workers lived under rationing and ideological constraint, while in the West, American trucks delivered coffee, cigarettes, and Coca-Cola. The contrast was psychological warfare at its purest. The prosperity gap widened until it became an iron curtain of its own. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1954. Strategically, the plan was flawless. Economically, it tied Western Europe together. Politically, it cemented American leadership. By 1955, West Germany joined NATO, a mere decade after surrendering unconditionally. The speed of reintegration stunned even Eisenhower. "We defeated them with fire," he wrote privately, "and we've conquered them with fairness." Eisenhower Papers, 1955. But beneath the prosperity was a relentless machine. Reconstruction demanded order, records, precision, the very qualities that had once powered Germany's war effort. The Americans had rechanneled those traits, turning militaristic efficiency into economic productivity. The Ruhr, once the armory of the Reich, became the workshop of the West. Siemens, BASF, Volkswagen, all were reborn under Allied supervision. The men who once built tanks were now building the engines of Europe's consumer revolution. Economic Cooperation Administration Industrial Review, 1953. And behind it all were the quiet heroes, engineers, machinists, and clerks, who worked through nights of exhaustion to keep the miracle alive. In Stuttgart, a young German engineer named Hans Krüger repaired Allied-supplied turbines in bombed-out workshops. In Essen, American technicians trained former Wehrmacht electricians to build transformers instead of munitions. Technical Assistance Program Report, 1952. Their tools were simple, but their purpose immense. "We used to destroy," one recalled. "Now we built because it was all that was left to do." Dramatized composite. In Washington, policymakers studied the results with astonishment. A revitalized Germany had become both a bulwark against communism and the cornerstone of Western Europe's new economic alliance. From these efforts emerged the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC, the embryo of what would later become the European Union. U.S. State Department Review, 1954. American funds had not only rebuilt a nation, they had bound a continent into a capitalist framework that outlived the plan itself. For the veterans, though the transformation was deeply personal, streets once filled with rubble now glittered with neon, shops bustled with trade, cafes filled with laughter instead of fear. Yet for many it was a strange peace, haunted by memory. "We fought them with everything," wrote a former infantry officer, "and now we live because they spared us." Bundesarchiv Personal Correspondence, 1955. The enemy had become a benefactor, the conqueror a partner. And in that paradox lay the defining truth of the modern world: power not through destruction, but through reconstruction. By 1960, West Germany's GDP had doubled. Exports surpassed pre-war levels. The world called it Das Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Federal Statistical Office Report, 1960. But behind every success statistic was the shadow of loss. 6 million German dead, 14 million displaced, entire generations scarred by guilt and memory. American policy did not erase that. It redirected it. The drive to rebuild became a moral redemption, a way to atone by creation. The United States had understood something profound. Hearts and minds could be engineered. Through food, work, and dignity, ideology could be replaced more effectively than through force. The veterans who had once saluted Hitler now saluted factory whistles, payroll schedules, and the steady hum of prosperity. The stars and stripes flew above bases, but they no longer symbolized occupation. They symbolized order. U.S. Army Europe Psychological Summary, 1956. And yet beyond the reconstruction, a new kind of war was taking shape. A war of ideas, influence, and culture. American engineers became diplomats, bankers became strategists, and aid packages replaced armies. The doctrine born in the ruins of Germany became America's master key for the next century. Rebuild your enemy, and he will become your ally. From Japan to Korea, from Vietnam to Iraq, echoes of that strategy would resurface, each time reshaped, each time tested. But its first proving ground, its flawless execution, began here in the dust of post-war Germany. The veterans who once fought under the Iron Cross would later build cars exported to Detroit. The war's victors and vanquished were now locked in a single, global economy, The Final Revenge of Peace. In a 1953 interview, General Lucius D. Clay was asked whether Germany's transformation was a moral act or a strategic one. He paused, smiled faintly, and said, "It was both. Because in our time, to build is to conquer," dramatized. And that was the lesson of it all, the greatest paradox of the 20th century, that a nation's power could lie not in its armies, but in its ability to rebuild what it once destroyed. Germany's veterans, who had seen the world collapse under the weight of their ambitions, now walked through streets lit by the kindness and calculation of their former enemies. For them, and for the generations to follow, one truth endured like the rising hum of machinery over a peaceful city. In modern war, the true victory belongs not to those who destroy fastest, but to those who rebuild first.